pale fingers of dawn stretched over the terracotta rooftops. The city stirred from its slumber with a low rumble of wooden shutters being thrown open, and the distant, melodic crowing of roosters echoing through the narrow, winding alleyways. And as the sun finally broke free of the horizon, spilling liquid gold over the sacred outcrop of the Acropolis, the Agora began its daily transformation from an empty stone square into a pulsating theater of human life, the air growing thick with the sharp, pungent cry of fishmongers hoisting glistening catches of the morning onto slabs of cool marble, and the deep, earthy aroma of fresh bread drifting from clay ovens to mingle with the acrid smoke of roasting meats, and the sweet perfume of crushed wild herbs underfoot. The city's heartbeat was a symphony of texture and sensation, where a philosopher seeking refuge from the mounting heat could press his palm against the cool, fluted column of the painted stoa, feeling the absolute solidity of the stone, while the dappled shade of a great plane tree danced on his shoulders, and the subtle murmur of his debating students drifted through the air like the hum of bees, a sound that competed with the clang of the bronze-smith's hammer and the gritty, dry scrape of the potter's wheel, spinning the red attic clay into elegant shapes in the dust-choked Karamakos district. Further out, in the open-air gymnasium, the world was stripped down to the pure physicality of the human form, where athletes moved in a synchronized dance of muscle and discipline, their bodies glistening with a slick mixture of sacred olive oil and fine, pale sand that clung to every ridge of sinew as they threw discus, and wrestled under the approving gaze of Hermes' stone effigy, while simultaneously, within the hushed, dim interior of a modest home, the matron of the family bowed her veiled head before the flickering flame of the household shrine, whispering a quiet invocation to Hestia that was punctuated by the soft, private crackle of the sacred fire, and the scent of a small honey cake offered in supplication. By late afternoon, the energy shifted toward the great rock of the Phoenix, where a tide of citizens, their sandals slapping against the worn stone path, gathered under the open sky, their political murmur swelling into a cacophony of democratic debate that sharpened the very air with the weight of impending votes and civic duty, a fervor that would later settle into a hushed reverence as a solemn, slow-moving procession of robed figures, carrying garlands of myrtle and bearing sacred vessels, wound its way up the sacred way toward the gleaming temples of the Acropolis, their chanted hymns floating down the slopes like a ghostly echo of a more divine age. Finally, as the relentless sun melted into the distant violet sea, and the rich, saturated colors of the day bled into the soft grays and blues of twilight, the frenetic energy drained from the streets until all that remained was the intimate, profound quiet of the domestic sphere, where one by one, small clay oil lamps sparked to life in the dark doorways of simple whitewashed homes, their trembling, golden flames casting dancing shadows on the plaster walls and pulling the entire city gently, irresistibly, into the deep, restorative silence of the Greek night. And as those small, flickering flames multiplied across the city like earthbound stars mirrored against the descending velvet of the night sky, the narrow streets did not fall completely silent, but rather shifted into a different, more intimate kind of existence, where the distant, rhythmic chirping of cicadas pulsed from the wild thyme on the hillsides, and a lone aloes player on a rooftop terrace breathed a melancholic, reedy melody into the cooling air that drifted down through the labyrinth of homes, past the shadowed Hermes statues standing sentinel at crossroads, and into the open courtyards where families gathered for their simple evening meal of olives, coarse bread, and watered wine, speaking in low, contented murmurs of the day's small triumphs, and the ancient stories of their gods that were stitched into the very fabric of their being. Under the silver light of the rising moon, the marble temples on the high rock were stripped of their daylight colors and stood as silent, luminous sentinels, their perfect geometry a frozen echo of a civilization's highest aspirations, while down in the industrial quarter, the nocturnal kilns of the master potters still glowed a deep, infernal orange, the fire masters meticulously stoking the chambers through the night to perfect the black gloss of their vessels. a secret alchemy of earth and flame that would one day be unearthed as timeless relics of this very moment in time. In the harbor district, the gentle lapping of the wine-dark sea against hundreds of wooden triremes and round-bellied merchant ships provided a liquid metronome for the sailors and traders who lingered late in the taverns, their sun-leathered faces illuminated by sputtering tallow candles as they whispered tales of far-off colonies and barbarian shores over games of knucklebones, their laughter a brief, bright flash of humanity against the immense, quiet darkness of Poseidon's domain. Deeper still within the city's heart, in a small, lamplit study cluttered with half-unrolled papyrus scrolls, a physician of the Hippocratic school bent over his notes, meticulously recording the progress of a fever in a patient, his observations a fragile but determined beam of rational thought pushing back against the vast mysteries of the body and the will of Asclepius, while a few streets away, a sleepless poet scratched a new line of an ode onto a wax tablet, searching for the precise word to capture the ache of beauty that the day had imprinted on his soul. This was the nocturnal rhythm, a quiet, pulsing undercurrent that balanced the democratic roar of the phoenix and the muscular exertion of the gymnasium with the profound, introspective labors of art, science, and simple human connection. A vast, breathing organism of stone, thought, and flesh, where every flickering lamp was a testimony that the city, even in its deepest slumber, never truly ceased its tireless, magnificent act of living, until at last, the profound indigo of the sky began to imperceptibly soften at the far edge of the world, promising the imminent return of rosy-fingered dawn and the glorious, relentless repetition of it all. And just before that first herald of dawn, when the night was at its deepest and most profound, a sacred hush settled over the city like a veil woven from the threads of Hypnos himself, a moment suspended outside of time, where even the stray dogs that scavenged the alleys for discarded olive pits and fish bones curled into tight circles beneath the marble porticos and fell into twitching dreams. And it was in this liminal space between the old night and the new day that the city seemed to breathe most deeply, its collective unconscious rising like a mist from the cisterns and the sacred springs, carrying with it the fragmented visions of every sleeping citizen, the hoplite dreaming of his shield's polished bronze flashing in the phalanx line, the merchant's wife dreaming of the rare silk that would arrive on the next ship from Miletus, the young ephebe dreaming of the laurel crown that awaited the victor at the Panathenaic Games, all of these private worlds swirling together in a great invisible river that flowed beneath the silent streets, and around the altar stones still warm with the ashes of the evening sacrifices. The entire polis held in the gentle palm of Morpheus, its worries and ambitions temporarily dissolved into the dark ether, while the eternal stars, those same distant fires that Orpheus and Homer had gazed upon, wheeled slowly overhead in their immutable courses, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell beneath them, yet somehow intimately connected to the fate of every mortal soul that slumbered within the city's encircling walls. And then, as if summoned by some primordial pact between the sun and the earth that had been sealed long before the first stone of the first temple was ever laid, the blackness at the very rim of the horizon began to bleed into a deep, impossible violet, a color so rich and transient that no painter's pigment could ever hope to capture it. And this violet seeped upward like wine staining a linen cloth, gradually transforming into a band of coral pink that ignited the undersides of the few wispy clouds that hung low over the mountains of Attica, and somewhere in the darkness, a single bird, a thrush perhaps, or a nightingale not yet ready to surrender its song to the day, trilled a brief, experimental note that hung in the motionless air like a droplet of sound waiting to be joined by others. And this solitary note acted as a signal to the sleeping city that the great cycle was about to begin its next turn, that the wheels of commerce and worship and politics and art were about to resume their eternal rotation. And in 1,000 homes, 1,000 pairs of eyes began to flutter beneath closed lids, sensing in that mysterious way of the sleeping mind that the darkness was thinning, that the warmth of the approaching sun was already stirring the molecules of the air, that the bread ovens would soon be stoked, that the market scales would soon be balanced, that the sacrificial fires would soon be lit upon the high rock, that the philosophers would soon take their places beneath the plane trees, that the potters would soon press their thumbs into the wet clay, that the scribes would soon mix their ink of soot and gum Arabic, that the wrestlers would soon oil their limbs, that the nurses would soon lift feverish children to their breasts, that the lovers would soon untangle from their sheets and face the day with the secret of their passion still burning behind their eyes, that every human soul in this great, intricate, magnificent mechanism of a city was about to be called back from the realm of dreams to take up their appointed role in the drama of civilization. And as that first true ray of golden sunlight, the rosy-fingered dawn that the blind poet had sung of in verses that had echoed across the wine-dark sea for centuries, finally broke free of the eastern mountains and struck the great bronze statue of Athena Primata that stood upon the Acropolis, setting its spear tip ablaze with a point of light so brilliant that it could be seen by the fishermen far out on the Saronic Gulf. The city erupted not with a sudden crash but with a gradual, swelling crescendo of life, a magnificent orchestration of sound and motion that began with the gentle creak of the great Dipolin gate being pushed open to admit the first farmers from the countryside, their wooden carts piled high with cabbages and onions and bundles of fragrant herbs, their donkeys' hooves clopping a slow, patient rhythm on the stone pavers as they made their way through the potter's quarter where the kiln fires had never been extinguished, and the artisans, their faces streaked with soot and their eyes red-rimmed from the long night's vigil, were already pulling the finished vases from the cooling chambers, holding them up to the early light to inspect the lustrous black glaze that adorned their surfaces, each vessel a perfect marriage of form and function destined to hold wine or oil or the ashes of the honored dead in some distant colony. And the potter's children, too young yet to work the wheel but old enough to run errands, darted through the narrow alleyways carrying clay cups of watered wine to their fathers and snatching bites of barley bread dipped in olive oil, their bare feet slapping against the earth that was still cool from the night's embrace. The Agra, that great beating heart of the democracy, began to fill with a tide of humanity that surged through its boundaries like water finding its level, and the stoas that lined its edges, those long covered walkways adorned with the vibrant paintings of Polygnotus and Mikan depicting the great battles against the Persians and the Amazons, became rivers of moving figures. Citizens wrapped in hematia of undyed wool and medics in their distinctive tunics, and the occasional foreign ambassador in barbarian trousers that drew curious glances from the idle youths who lounged against the columns. And the air, oh, the air itself was a banquet for the senses, thick with the commingled aromas of sizzling sausages being turned on bronze grills by vendors who shouted their prices in the sing-song cadences of the Attic dialect, and the sharp, astringent scent of fresh garlic being pounded into a paste in stone mortars, and the heady perfume of myrrh and frankincense drifting from the stalls of the perfume sellers, who had imported their precious resins from the distant lands of Arabia at great risk and expense, and the earthy, primal smell of leather being stretched and cut by the sandal makers who sat cross-legged beneath awnings of woven reeds, and the metallic tang of silver coins being tested by the trapezotai. The bankers who sat behind their tables with their scales and their weights, carefully verifying the purity of the Athenian owls that bore the sacred image of the goddess on one side, and her symbol, the wise-eyed bird, on the other. Coins that were recognized and trusted from the shores of Sicily to the markets of Egypt, a tangible symbol of the city's economic might and the integrity that underpinned it. And in the shadow of the Stoa Basileus, the royal stoa where the Archon Basilius presided over cases of impiety and religious disputes, a crowd had already gathered to watch a trial that would determine the fate of a man accused of revealing the sacred mysteries of Eleusis to the uninitiated, a crime of such profound gravity that the very air around the proceedings seemed to crackle with tension. The jurors, 500 citizens chosen by lot, sitting on their wooden benches and fanning themselves with palm fronds as the prosecutor, his voice rising and falling with the practiced cadences of a trained rhetor, painted a picture of divine wrath and civic pollution so vivid that the accused, a pale, thin man with the ink-stained fingers of a scribe, seemed to shrink into himself, his eyes fixed on the ground as if he could already feel the weight of the hemlock on his tongue. And the crowd, that fickle, passionate, utterly human crowd that was both the glory and the terror of the democracy, murmured and shifted, and offered its unsolicited opinions in whispers that buzzed like flies around the edges of the proceedings. And a philosopher who had come to the market to buy figs for his morning meal paused at the edge of the gathering and stroked his beard, his mind already turning the spectacle into a meditation on justice and rhetoric, and the dangerous power of words to shape reality itself. Meanwhile, far from the noise and the drama of the agora, in the cool, columned courtyard of a modest house on the slopes of the Areopagus, a woman of the citizen class, her hair bound up in a saccos of crimson wool, and her peplos fastened with bronze pins at her shoulders, supervised the household slaves as they spun wool into thread and thread into cloth. The great warp-weighted loom standing against the wall like a silent monument to the domestic arts that were the domain of women since the time of Penelope, and her young daughter, a girl of perhaps 12 years with the solemn eyes of one who understood that childhood was a fleeting season, sat at her mother's feet and practiced her letters on a wax tablet, carefully incising the Greek alphabet with a bronze stylus while her mother corrected her grip and her posture. For this was a household that valued literacy, that believed a woman should be able to read the poets and keep the household accounts and recite the prayers to the goddesses in the proper Attic pronunciation. And in the corner of the courtyard, beneath a small fig tree that was just beginning to set its fruit, the household altar to Hestia glowed with the eternal flame that was never allowed to go out. The sacred fire that connected this humble dwelling to the great public hearth of the city, and to the primordial fire that Prometheus himself had stolen from Olympus to give to mortals, a chain of light and warmth and civilization that stretched back to the very dawn of human existence. Up on the Acropolis, the sacred rock that rose from the heart of the city like an altar built by the gods themselves, the priests and priestesses of Athena Polias had already begun their morning rituals, purifying themselves with water drawn from the sacred spring, and donning the spotless white garments that were required for those who would approach the goddess in her temple. And as the sun climbed higher and its rays fell upon the sculpted figures of the Parthenon's pediments, the gods and giants and heroes frozen forever in their marble struggles seemed to stir and come to life, their stone flesh warmed to the color of honey, their sightless eyes seeming to follow the movements of the worshippers who climbed the great marble steps with offerings of honey cakes and wine, and the first fruits of the season. And in the Erechtheion, that strange and sacred building that housed the ancient wooden statue of Athena that had fallen from the sky in the time of the mythical kings, the olive-wood effigy that was so old and so holy that its origins had been forgotten even by the oldest priests, the sacred serpent that was the guardian of the temple and the living embodiment of Erechtheus himself stirred in its enclosure, and tasted the air with its forked tongue, accepting the honeyed offerings that the priestesses placed before it with the solemn understanding that, as long as the serpent ate and the sacred olive tree grew and the eternal flame burned, the city would endure. Protected by the gray-eyed goddess who had won the contest with Poseidon and given the Athenians the olive, the greatest gift of all, a source of food and light and peace that had shaped the destiny of the polis for 1,000 years. And in the gymnasium that lay outside the city walls, beside the banks of the Ilissos River where the plane trees grew thick, and the grass was still green from the winter rains, the young men of the citizen class had already stripped off their tunics, and were anointing their bodies with the golden olive oil that gleamed on their skin like liquid amber, their muscles, honed by years of training in the palestra, shifting and flexing beneath their sun-browned flesh as they stretched and prepared for the day's exercises. And the Patatribes, the trainer, a man of perhaps 50 years whose own body was a testament to the principles of the discipline he taught, walked among them with a forked stick of olive wood, correcting a stance here, adjusting a grip there, his voice a low, steady rumble of instruction and encouragement and occasional reproof. And in one corner of the gymnasium, a group of older athletes were practicing the pankration, the all-powerful combat sport that combined wrestling and boxing into a single. Brutal discipline, their fists wrapped in leather straps as they grappled and struck in the pale dust, their grunts of effort echoing off the stone walls while younger boys watched with wide eyes, dreaming of the day when they too would compete in the games and earn the glory that was the birthright of every Greek male. And beyond the wrestling pits, in the dromos, the running track, another group of youths ran their laps, their bare feet pounding a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth, their breath coming in measured gasps as they pushed their bodies to the limit in pursuit of that elusive perfection that the Greeks called arid, the excellence that encompassed body and mind and spirit in a single, harmonious whole that was the highest aspiration of their civilization. And as the morning deepened into the full blaze of noon, when the sun hung directly overhead, and the shadows contracted to small dark pools at the feet of the statues and the columns, the city's rhythm shifted once again, the frantic energy of the market giving way to a slower, more languorous pace as the heat drove the citizens indoors to seek the cool shade of their homes, and the refreshment of a midday meal of bread and cheese and olives washed down with wine that had been mixed with water in the great craters. And in the symposium rooms of the wealthy, the couches were already being arranged for the evening's gathering, when the men of the upper classes would recline on cushions stuffed with wool and drink from painted cups that depicted the exploits of Dionysus and his Maenads, discussing philosophy and politics and the latest plays of Sophocles and Euripides, while flute girls played their melodies and the wine, that great loosener of tongues and truths, flowed freely into the night. But for now, in the deep stillness of the noon hour, the city seemed to hold its breath, the very stones radiating back the stored heat of the morning, the dogs panting in the shadows, the fountains murmuring their eternal liquid songs, the whole vast mechanism of urban life idling momentarily before the great engine of the afternoon began to turn once more. And in that quiet, suspended moment, when even the cicadas seemed to pause their endless stridulation, the city existed in a state of pure, timeless being, a perfect microcosm of the Greek world, balanced between the savage past and the unknowable future, held in the golden light of the present, eternal and fragile and utterly breathtakingly alive in every stone and soul and sacred olive leaf that swayed in the gentle breeze from the Saronic Gulf, a breeze that carried with it the smell of salt and adventure, and the distant promise of colonies yet to be founded, and stories yet to be told and heroes yet to be born, all of it contained in this single, perfect, sun-drenched moment on the rocky soil of Attica, where the greatest experiment in human civilization continued to unfold, day by day, hour by hour, breath by breath. As it had for generations, and as it would, the citizens prayed to their immortal gods, continue for generations yet to come. And it was precisely this prayer, this whispered entreaty to the immortal gods that rose like incense from every hearth and temple and wayside shrine, that constituted the invisible architecture upon which the entire edifice of the city was built. For the Greek mind perceived no boundary between the sacred and the profane, no wall separating the realm of the divine from the realm of the civic, but rather saw every human action as existing within a great cosmic web of obligation and reciprocity that bound mortals to the Olympians in an eternal dance of sacrifice and favor, of hubris and nemesis, of glory and ruin. And so even as the city slumbered through the white heat of noon, the unseen presence of the gods pressed in upon it from all sides, Athena in her bronze helmet watching over the fortress that bore her name, Hephaestus in his volcanic forge beneath the island of Lemnos, sending up the fumes that inspired the smiths and the potters and the goldsmiths in their dusty workshops, Apollo in his distant temple at Delphi, sending forth the oracles that guided the colonists and the lawgivers and the generals in their most desperate hours, Dionysus in the wild places of the mountains loosening the minds of his devotees with wine and ecstatic dance, Demeter in the ripening grain fields promising the renewal of life even in the face of death, and all the lesser deities, the nymphs of the springs and the trees, the heroes of the local cults, the household snakes that guarded the storerooms, the restless dead who required libations of milk and honey at the crossroads, the entire vast pantheon of divine and semi-divine beings that populated the Greek cosmos and demanded their due from the living. A due that was rendered not merely out of fear, but out of a profound and abiding sense of piety, of eusebeia, that virtue which the Greeks understood not as a private sentiment, but as the very glue that held the polis together, and without which the city would crumble into chaos, and the gods would turn their faces away in anger, leaving the fields barren and the women childless and the enemy triumphant at the gates. And it was with this piety burning in their hearts, this sense of their absolute dependence on the favor of the immortals, that the citizens of the city arose from their midday rest and prepared themselves for the rituals that would fill the afternoon, the sacrifices and the libations, and the processions that marked the calendar of the polis as surely as the rising and setting of the sun marked the passage of the days. And in the great temple of Athena on the Acropolis, the priests were already selecting the finest of the sacrificial oxen from the herd that had been driven up the sacred way, animals of perfect white with gilded horns and garlands of flowers around their massive necks, animals that had been bred for this single purpose, to die beneath the knife, so that the goddess might feast upon the thigh bones wrapped in fat, and the city might feast upon the roasted meat. For the Greek sacrifice was at once a solemn religious duty and a joyous communal banquet, a moment when the boundaries between the human and the divine were temporarily dissolved, and the whole population of the polis, from the wealthiest aristocrat to the humblest metic, partook of the bounty that the gods had provided, the rich, fatty smoke rising from the altar and curling into the blue attic sky, while the aulos players piped their shrill melodies, and the choirs of young maidens sang the ancient hymns in praise of the gray-eyed virgin goddess, who had sprung fully armed from the head of Zeus, and had chosen this rocky citadel as her earthly dwelling place for all eternity. Meanwhile, in the Bouleuterion, the council chamber that stood at the edge of the Agora, the 500 members of the Boule, the council of 500 who were chosen by lot from the citizen body and who served for a year, took their seats on the curved stone benches and prepared for the afternoon's deliberations, for the work of the democracy never ceased, the endless round of debate and vote and legislation that governed every aspect of the city's life. From the maintenance of the triremes in the harbor to the regulation of the grain trade to the appointment of ambassadors to foreign courts, and the herald, a man of imposing stature with a voice that could carry to the farthest reaches of the chamber, called the assembly to order and read out the agenda that had been posted in the Agora days before, and one by one the citizens rose to speak, some with the practiced eloquence of men who had studied rhetoric under the great sophists, others with the halting, earnest speech of farmers and artisans who had never addressed their fellow citizens before but who felt the weight of the moment pressing upon them. For this was the miracle of the Athenian democracy, that every citizen, regardless of his wealth or his birth or his education, had the right to speak his mind and cast his vote and shape the destiny of the city that was, in the famous words of Pericles, the school of Hellas, the shining example to all the Greek world of what free men could achieve when they governed themselves according to the laws that they themselves had created. And beneath the surface of these grand political machinations, the intimate, domestic life of the city continued its eternal rhythm, a rhythm that had pulsed through the houses and the workshops and the narrow alleyways for centuries, connecting the present moment to the age of Solon and Draco and the mythical kings who had ruled in the time before history. And in a small, dim room at the back of a modest house near the Dipylon Gate, a midwife of the city, a woman of perhaps 60 years with hands that were gnarled and strong from a lifetime of bringing new life into the world, knelt beside a young woman in the throes of labor, her voice a low, soothing stream of encouragement and instruction as she massaged the woman's belly with warm olive oil, and offered her sips of water mixed with honey and the crushed leaves of herbs that eased the pains of childbirth. And the young woman, a bride of only 15 years who had left her father's house just 9 months before, gripped the hands of her mother and her mother-in-law, who knelt on either side of the birthing couch, their faces etched with the universal expressions of hope and fierce, protective love that had accompanied women through this ancient ordeal since the first humans had walked upon the earth. And in the courtyard beyond the birthing chamber, the men of the household waited in anxious silence, the young husband packing back and forth before the altar of Hestia, while his father and his uncles offered quiet prayers to Artemis, the goddess of childbirth, and to Eileithyia, her attendant, who could ease the passage of the infant from the womb, or, if she was angered, could prolong the labor into an agony that might claim both mother and child. For childbirth in the ancient world was a battle as perilous as any fought on the field of war, and the outcome was never certain until the infant's first cry shattered the silence, and the midwife emerged from the chamber with the newborn, washed and swaddled and ready to be presented to the father, who would decide whether the child would be raised in the household or exposed on the hillside to the mercy of the gods and the wild animals. A decision that every Greek father faced with the heavy understanding that the survival of his family and his city depended on the careful allocation of resources and the ruthless calculus of a world that had no room for weakness or sentimentality. As the afternoon began to fade and the shadows of the columns lengthened across the marble pavements, the city's attention turned to the great cultural institutions that had made Athens the envy of the Greek world. The theaters and the odeons and the lecture halls where the poets and the philosophers and the musicians competed for the favor of the muses and the applause of the citizens, and in the theater of Dionysus that lay on the southern slope of the Acropolis, the chorus of a new tragedy was rehearsing for the upcoming festival of the city Dionysia, their voices rising and falling in the intricate harmonies that had been composed by the poet who stood before them, a man with the laurel crown of a victor already on his brow and a papyrus roll in his hand, marking the rhythm with a staff of olive wood while the chorgos, the wealthy citizen who had been appointed by the archon to finance the production as a liturgy, a public service that was both an honor and a burden, watched from the front row with the anxious expression of a man whose reputation and political future depended on the success of the performance. For the theater in Athens was not merely entertainment but a sacred ritual, a collective meditation on the great questions of human existence, the nature of justice and fate and the will of the gods, the terrible consequences of pride and the redemptive power of suffering. Questions that were enacted on the stage before the assembled citizenry, and that sent them out into the night with their souls cleansed, and their minds expanded, and their sense of their own humanity deepened and complicated in ways that no mere speech or debate could achieve. And when at last the sun began its descent toward the violet peaks of the Egalius Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose and gold that would have inspired the painters of the painted Stoa to new heights of artistic achievement, the city began its slow, graceful transition from the labors of the day to the pleasures of the evening, the men of the wealthier classes gathering in the andron, the men's quarters of their homes, where the couches were arranged around the central crater and the torches were lit, and the wine was mixed with water in the proper proportions, 3 parts water to 1 part wine for civilized drinking, any stronger mixture being the mark of the barbarian and the drunkard, and the guests arrived in a slow stream, wearing their finest himation and leaning on the shoulders of their slaves, who carried their sandals and their flasks of oil and their strigils. For the symposium was a highly formalized affair with its own rules and rituals, its appointed symposiarch who determined the ratio of the wine mixture and the topics of conversation, its games of katabos in which the drinkers flicked the dregs of their wine at a target in the center of the room, its recitations of poetry, and its philosophical debates that might last until the first light of dawn. And as the wine flowed and the music of the flute girls filled the smoke-hazed air, the men discussed the great questions of the day, the impending war with Sparta, the latest scandal involving Alcibiades and his sacrilegious mockery of the Eleusinian mysteries, the nature of love and beauty, and the immortality of the soul, debates that would later be immortalized in the dialogues of Plato and the treatises of Aristotle, and that would echo down the centuries to shape the minds of countless generations, yet unborn. And in the Kerameikos, the potter's quarter that had given its name to the great cemetery beyond the walls, the artisans were still at work even as the light failed, their kilns glowing like the forges of Hephaestus against the darkening sky, their hands moving with the automatic precision of men who had spent their entire lives mastering the mysteries of clay and fire and glaze, and the vases they produced, the amphorae and the craters and the lekythoi and the kylixes, were not merely vessels for wine and oil, but canvases for the greatest artists of the age, men whose names would be remembered long after the names of the politicians and the generals had faded into obscurity, and on the surface of a great amphora that would soon be shipped to a Greek colony on the distant shores of the Black Sea, a painter was depicting a scene from the Trojan War. Achilles dragging the body of Hector behind his chariot, while Priam and Hecuba watched in horror from the walls of the doomed city, a scene of such raw, visceral power that it seemed to move and breathe in the flickering light of the oil lamps, a reminder to all who beheld it of the terrible cost of war and the inexorable workings of fate that even the greatest heroes could not escape. And as the night deepened and the stars emerged in their countless thousands, the same stars that the astronomers of Miletus had mapped, and the poets of Lesbos had sung, and the navigators of Phakia had steered by on their voyages to the pillars of Heracles and beyond, the city gradually surrendered itself to sleep once more, the symposiums breaking up with drunken laughter and philosophical epiphanies, the last of the oil lamps being extinguished in the windows of the houses, the guards on the walls stamping their feet against the chill of the night and peering out into the darkness for any sign of approaching enemies, the dogs settling down in their accustomed spots with sighs of canine contentment. And in the quietest hour, when even the most dedicated philosopher had laid aside his scrolls and the most passionate lover had fallen into the satiated slumber that follows the act of love, the city existed as it had in the beginning, and as it would in the end, a fragile, magnificent, utterly human creation of stone and wood and sweat and dreams, a city that had raised temples to the gods and sent ships to the edges of the known world, and invented democracy and philosophy and theater and history, a city whose name would be spoken with awe and reverence for millennia after its walls had crumbled and its gods had been forgotten, and its language had evolved into forms its founders could never have imagined, but that for now, in this eternal present, that was the only reality any of its citizens had ever known, pulsed with the breath and the blood and the infinite, irreducible complexity of human life in all its glory and its suffering, its triumphs and its tragedies, its moments of transcendent beauty and its long, slow passages of ordinary time, the whole vast, intricate tapestry of existence woven together on the loom of the polis, thread by thread, moment by moment, life by life, stretching back into the dim, mythological past and forward into the unknowable, unwritten future, held together by nothing more substantial than the shared belief of its citizens that this way of life, this civilization, this fragile experiment in human freedom and human dignity, was worth living and dying and killing for, a belief that burned as bright and as eternal as the sacred flame on the altar of Hestia, the flame that was never allowed to go out, the flame that connected every household to the public hearth and every citizen to the polis and every mortal to the immortal gods, the flame that was the soul of the city itself, flickering but never extinguishing, dancing but never dying, the still point of the turning world around which all the noise and the motion and the chaos of urban life revolved in its ceaseless, magnificent, eternal dance. And this eternal dance, this ceaseless, magnificent turning of the polis around the still point of the sacred flame, was not merely a metaphor woven by poets to comfort the sleepless in the dark hours of the night, but was rather the fundamental truth upon which all of Greek civilization rested, a truth that manifested itself in every aspect of the city's existence from the grandest public monument to the humblest private gesture. And it was with this truth pressing upon their consciousness like the weight of the warm Aegean sun that the citizens of the city awoke on the morning of the great festival of the Panathenaea, the most sacred day in the Athenian calendar, the day when the entire polis, every man, woman, child, medic, freedman, and even the slaves, at least those whose masters permitted it, gathered to honor the goddess Athena and to reaffirm the bonds of civic unity that held the city together against the constant pressures of faction and class, and the ever-present threat of war from the jealous rivals who encircled Attica on every side. Long before the first light of dawn had touched the bronze spear of the primachos, the priests and the priestesses and the orhephoroi, the young girls chosen from the noblest families to serve the goddess for a year, had risen from their beds in the sacred precincts and begun the elaborate rituals of purification that would prepare them for the day's ceremonies, bathing in the sacred waters of the Calero spring and donning the spotless white garments that had been woven by the hands of the Ergasteni. The maiden weavers who had spent the preceding months laboring in the chambers of the Acropolis to create the great peplos, the magnificent saffron-dyed robe that would be presented to the ancient olive-wood statue of Athena Polias, the statue that had fallen from the sky in the time of Erechtheus, and that was so sacred that its face was veiled from the eyes of the uninitiated, its surface blackened by centuries of incense smoke, and anointed with the holy oil that was renewed each year in a ritual, whose origins were lost in the mists of the Bronze Age, when the first Achaean chieftains had raised their crude stone altars on this sacred rock, and made their offerings of bulls and rams to the goddess who they believed held their fragile citadel in the palm of her immortal hand. And as the darkness began to thin, and the stars to fade, and the first tentative notes of birdsong to rise from the olive groves that surrounded the city, the great procession began to form in the Kerameikos, the potter's quarter that lay just beyond the Dipylon gate, and the participants, thousands upon thousands of them, gathered in their appointed places according to their age and their status and their role in the ceremony, the cavalrymen mounted on their finest horses, their bronze armor polished to a mirror brightness, and their helmets crowned with the long horsehair plumes that made them seem taller and more terrible than ordinary mortals, the hoplites marching in their phalanx formations, their shields decorated with the emblems of their clans and their tribes, the citizens bearing on their shoulders the great baskets of offerings and the sacred vessels, and the skins of wine that would be poured out in libation to the goddess, the medics, the resident foreigners who were permitted to participate in the procession, but not in the inner mysteries of the cult, dressed in their distinctive purple robes and bearing the trays of honey cakes and the garlands of flowers, the young girls of the noble families walking with their heads bowed in modesty and their eyes fixed on the ground before them, their hair bound up in the elaborate coiffures that marked their status as future wives and mothers of citizens, and the old men, the veterans of Marathon and Salamis and a dozen lesser battles, their weathered faces bearing the scars of the wars that had preserved the city's freedom against the incursions of the Persians and the Spartans, and all the other enemies who had sought to extinguish the flame of Athenian liberty, walking slowly, and with the dignity that came from a lifetime of service to the polis, their voices raised in the ancient hymns that had been sung on this day for 1,000 years, and that would be sung, if the gods willed it, for 1,000 years yet to come. At the head of the procession, drawn by a team of pure white oxen whose horns had been gilded for the occasion, and whose massive necks were garlanded with wreaths of myrtle and laurel, the great ship cart, the peplos itself, rolled slowly through the streets, and upon its deck, spread out like a sail for all the city to see, was the sacred robe that the maidens had woven, a magnificent tapestry of saffron and purple and gold thread that depicted the battle of the gods and the giants, the Gigantomachy, in which Athena herself had fought alongside her father Zeus and had cast down the rebel Enceladus and buried him beneath the island of Sicily, where he still raged against his bonds, and sent up the volcanic fires of Mount Etna as a reminder of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, civilization and barbarism, reason and unreason, a struggle that was reenacted in every generation and in every human heart, and that found its ultimate expression in the life of the polis. The community of free citizens who had bound themselves together under the rule of law and the protection of the gods, and who had sworn to defend their city and their way of life against all enemies, foreign and domestic, human and divine, visible and invisible. The cart rumbled over the stone-paved streets, its great wooden wheels creaking under the weight of the sacred cargo. And as it passed, the crowds that lined the streets pressed forward to catch a glimpse of the peplos, and to receive the blessings that radiated from it like heat from a fire. And the air was filled with the mingled sounds of the sacred hymns, and the cries of the vendors selling figs and honey cakes, and the laughter of the children who darted between the legs of the adults, and the lowing of the sacrificial animals that were being herded toward the altar on the Acropolis. And the whole city seemed to breathe as a single organism, united in a purpose that transcended the petty divisions and rivalries of everyday life, and that connected the present moment to the deepest roots of the Athenian identity, the myths and the rituals, and the shared memories that made the Athenians a single people with a single destiny. And as the procession wound its way through the Agora, past the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, where the shields of the heroes of the Persian wars hung as eternal memorials to the courage of the ancestors, past the great bronze statues of the Tyrannicides, Harmodius and Aristogiton, who had struck down the tyrant Hipparchus and liberated the city from the yoke of the Pisistratids, past the altar of the 12 gods that marked the very center of the city, and from which all distances in Attica were measured, the citizens paused in their singing and their marching to gaze upon these monuments of their history, and to reflect upon the long and arduous journey that had brought them to this moment, the centuries of struggle and sacrifice that had transformed a small, insignificant settlement on a rocky peninsula into the greatest power in the Greek world, the school of Hellas, the city that had turned back the might of the Persian Empire at Marathon and Salamis and Plataea, the city that had built the Parthenon and the Propylaea, and the other wonders of the Periclean building program, the city that had produced Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes and Thucydides and Plato, and all the other giants of literature and philosophy whose works would endure for as long as human beings continued to read and think and wonder at the mysteries of existence. And yet, even as they celebrated their past glories, the Athenians knew in their hearts that the future was uncertain, that the Peloponnesian War with Sparta and her allies dragged on year after bloody year with no end in sight, that the treasury was depleted, and the young men were dying on distant battlefields, and the plague that had struck the city in the early years of the war had carried off Pericles himself, the great statesman who had guided the democracy through its golden age. And this knowledge lent a particular poignancy to the day's celebrations, a sense that the present moment was precious precisely because it was fragile, that the great edifice of Athenian civilization could be brought crashing down at any moment by the fortunes of war or the anger of the gods or the folly of the citizens themselves. And so they sang their hymns and made their sacrifices, and performed their rituals with a fervor that was born of both gratitude and fear. The gratitude of men and women who knew how fortunate they were to live in such a city at such a time, and the fear of men and women who knew how easily it could all be taken away. And when at last the procession reached the great marble stairway that led up to the Propylaea, the magnificent gateway to the Acropolis that had been built by the architect Nesicles at the command of Pericles, and that had consumed more money than any building in the history of the city, a sum that the enemies of the democracy never tired of citing as evidence of the extravagance and the arrogance of the Athenian people, the priests of Athena, who had been walking in solemn silence at the very rear of the procession, moved to the front and began the slow, stately ascent toward the sacred precinct, their white robes gleaming in the noonday sun, and their voices rising in the ancient hymn to Athena that was sung only on this day, and only by those who had been initiated into the deepest mysteries of the cult, a hymn whose words were so old and so sacred that they were no longer fully understood even by the priests who sang them. preserved through the centuries by the power of oral tradition and the reverence for the past that was so deeply ingrained in the Greek character that it was almost a form of piety in its own right. And behind the priests came the bearers of the peplos, the strong young men of the citizen class who had been chosen for this honor by the Archon Basilius, and who had spent the preceding months in a state of ritual purity, abstaining from wine and meat, and the company of women, so that they might be worthy to carry the sacred robe into the presence of the goddess. And behind them came the animals for the sacrifice, the 100 oxen that would be slaughtered on the great altar before the Parthenon, and their thigh bones wrapped in fat and burned as an offering to Athena, while the meat was distributed to the citizens in a great communal feast that was the largest and most elaborate of all the public banquets that punctuated the Athenian calendar, a feast that would be remembered and talked about for the rest of the year, and that would serve as the standard against which all other feasts were measured. And as the procession passed through the Propylaea and entered the sacred precinct, the vast plateau of the Acropolis that had been leveled and paved with marble, and adorned with temples and statues and altars that were the wonder of the entire Greek world, a hush fell over the crowd, for they were now in the presence of the goddess, in the very heart of her earthly dwelling place, and the weight of the sacred pressed down upon them like a physical force, silencing the chatter and the laughter and even the crying of the infants, so that the only sounds were the chanting of the priests and the lowing of the doomed oxen and the steady, measured footsteps of the thousands of worshippers who had ascended the sacred rock to pay their respects to the gray-eyed virgin who watched over their city and their lives. And when the peplos had been placed upon the ancient olive-wood statue, and the prayers had been recited, and the sacrifices had been performed, and the smoke of the burning thigh bones had risen into the blue attic sky in a column that could be seen for miles in every direction, the citizens descended from the Acropolis and returned to their homes for the great feast that would continue long into the night. A feast at which the wine flowed freely, and the meat was plentiful, and the conversation ranged over the great questions of the day, the conduct of the war and the prospects for peace, and the latest plays that had been performed at the Dionysia, and the rumors of new philosophical schools that were being founded by the followers of Socrates, that strange and troublesome man who went about the Agora questioning everyone he met, and who seemed to believe that the unexamined life was not worth living, a doctrine that many of the older citizens found deeply unsettling, and that they feared would corrupt the youth and undermine the traditional values upon which the polis depended. And as the feast continued and the torches were lit, and the shadows danced on the whitewashed walls of the houses, the citizens reflected on the meaning of the day and on their place in the long history of their city, a history that stretched back to the time of the gods and the heroes, and that would stretch forward, they prayed, into a future that would be as glorious as the past. A future in which the temples on the Acropolis would still stand, and the democracy would still function, and the philosophers would still debate, and the poets would still sing, and the sacred flame on the altar of Hestia would still burn, eternal and undying, the still point of the turning world around which the whole vast, intricate, magnificent dance of the polis revolved in its ceaseless, eternal and utterly human rhythm, a rhythm that had begun before any of them were born, and that would continue. If the gods were willing, and the citizens remained true to their ancestors and their laws, long after all of them had returned to the dust from which they came and been forgotten by the generations yet to be born, a rhythm that was the very heartbeat of the Greek world, steady and strong and unbreakable, the rhythm of the city and the rhythm of civilization, and the rhythm of life itself in all its beauty and its terror, and its inexhaustible, transcendent mystery. And this inexhaustible, transcendent mystery, this rhythm of life that pulsed through the polis like blood through the veins of a living body, was nowhere more palpable than in the dark, smoke-filled chambers of the healing sanctuaries that lay on the outskirts of the city, where the sick and the afflicted gathered in desperate hope of a cure, that the physicians with their herbs and their scalpels and their Hippocratic maxims had been unable to provide, for the Greeks. for all their rationality and their logic and their relentless questioning of the natural world, understood that there were forces at work in the universe that lay beyond the reach of human reason, forces that could heal or harm, bless or curse, restore to life or consign to death. And in the great sanctuary of Asclepius that lay in the shadow of the Acropolis, the god of healing who had been raised from the dead by Zeus himself, and granted the power to cure all the diseases that afflicted mortal flesh. The suppliants gathered in the evening twilight, their faces pale with illness and their eyes bright with the fever of hope, and the priests of the god, men who had inherited the secret knowledge that had been passed down from the time of the divine healer himself, moved among them with their sacred staffs and their snakes and their vials of mysterious elixirs, chanting the ancient incantations that prepared the sick for the great ritual of incubation that was the heart of the healing cult. And as the oil lamps were extinguished one by one, and the temple was plunged into the profound, sacred darkness that was the prerequisite for the divine encounter, the suppliants lay down on the stone floors and the pallets of straw that had been arranged in the long colonnaded porticos, their bodies trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation, for they knew that the god would come to them in the night, that he would appear in their dreams in the form of a man, a snake, a dog, or sometimes merely a disembodied voice, and that he would either cure them on the spot with a touch of his divine hand, or prescribe a regimen of diet and exercise and herbal remedies that would restore them to health over the course of weeks or months. And the priests had instructed them to remain silent and still, to empty their minds of all earthly concerns, and to open their hearts to the presence of the god. And so they lay in the darkness, listening to the soft rustling of the sacred snakes that slithered across the floor, the non-venomous serpents that were the living embodiments of Asclepius, and that were believed to lick the wounds of the sick and impart the divine healing power through their touch. And the air was thick with the smell of incense, and the faint, sweet scent of the opium poppies that were burned on the altars to induce the visionary state. And one by one, the suppliants fell into a sleep that was not quite sleep, a state of consciousness that hovered between waking and dreaming, and in that liminal space the god came to them, appearing in forms that were as varied as the diseases that afflicted them. And some of the suppliants cried out in their sleep, and some wept and some smiled with the serene, beatific expressions of those who had seen the face of the divine. And when the first light of dawn filtered through the marble columns, and the priests came to wake them, some of the sick rose from their pallets whole and healed, their tumors vanished and their fevers broken, and their crippled limbs restored to full function, while others clutched in their hands the clay tablets on which the god had inscribed the prescriptions that they must follow if they wished to be cured, prescriptions that they would present to the priests for interpretation, and that would guide their treatment in the weeks and months to come. And in the cold light of morning, as the healed and the hopping made their way back to their homes through the streets that were already filling with the familiar sounds of the waking city, they passed by the workshops of the sculptors and the stonemasons who labored in the shadow of the Acropolis, their chisels and their mallets ringing out a steady, percussive rhythm that had not ceased for a generation, ever since Pericles had announced his great plan to rebuild the temples that the Persians had burned, and to make Athens the undisputed artistic capital of the Greek world. And in the studio of Phidias, the greatest sculptor of the age, a man whose name would be remembered and revered for as long as the memory of Greek civilization endured, the great master and his assistants were putting the final touches on the colossal bronze statue of Athena Primachos that would stand on the Acropolis and serve as a beacon for ships far out at sea. And the artist himself, a man whose face was lined with the concentration of a lifetime spent in the pursuit of perfect beauty, climbed the scaffolding that surrounded the towering figure and examined the work from every angle, his eyes missing no imperfection, no flaw in the casting or the polishing that might detract from the majesty of the goddess, and he directed his assistants with the quiet authority of a man who had been entrusted by the demos with the sacred task of rendering the divine in bronze and marble and gold and ivory. And the assistants, young men who had come from every corner of the Greek world to study under the master, and to learn the secrets of his art, obeyed his commands with the reverent alacrity of acolytes serving a priest. For they knew that they were participating in the creation of something that would outlast them, something that would still be standing and admired and wondered at long after they and their children and their children's children had returned to the dust. And in the Agra, where the morning sun was already beginning to burn off the cool mist that had settled in the low places during the night, the merchants and the bankers and the politicians were gathering for another day of commerce and debate, and the endless, intricate dance of the democracy, and the stoas were filling with the usual crowd of idlers and philosophers and men of affairs who had come to exchange the latest news and gossip, and to conduct the business that kept the great engine of the city running. The grain merchants from the Black Sea colonies who haggled over prices with the bakers and the millers, the wine merchants from Chios and Lesbos and Thassos who offered samples of their vintages to the owners of the symposium rooms, the olive oil merchants from the great estates of the interior whose product was prized throughout the Mediterranean for its purity and its flavor, the slave dealers from the markets of Delos and Corinth, who displayed their human merchandise on raised platforms, and extolled the virtues of their wares in the same cadenced, practiced tones that the horse traders used in the livestock markets. The armorers and the weaponsmiths whose business had never been better than in these years of endless war, their shops cluttered with the breastplates and the greaves and the shields and the spears that would soon be carried into battle against the Spartans or the Thebans, or whatever enemy the assembly had most recently voted to attack, and the prostitutes, the hetairai who were the most educated and independent women in the city, women who had studied philosophy and rhetoric and music, and who were the companions of the most powerful men in the democracy, moving through the crowd with the easy, confident grace of those who knew that they were essential to the functioning of the masculine world of politics and commerce that surrounded them. And in the painted stoa, the great covered walkway that was adorned with the magnificent frescoes that depicted the battles of Marathon and Ono, and the victory of Theseus over the Amazons, a crowd had gathered around a group of philosophers who were engaged in a debate that had been going on, in one form or another, since the days of Thales and Anaximander and the other Ionian thinkers who had first begun to question the traditional myths and to seek natural explanations for the phenomena of the world. And the debate that day concerned the nature of the soul and its fate after death, a question that had taken on a new urgency in the wake of the plague and the war and the general sense of unease that had settled over the city like a pall, and the philosophers, who represented the various schools that had emerged in the decades since the death of Socrates, argued with the passionate intensity of men whose very identities were bound up in their doctrines, the followers of Plato insisting that the soul was immortal and immaterial, and that it would be judged after death according to the life it had lived on earth, the followers of Aristotle arguing that the soul was the form of the body, and that it could not exist independently of the flesh that it animated, the followers of Democritus and the atomists maintaining that the soul was composed of fine, subtle atoms that dissolved into the air at the moment of death, and the followers of the sophists scoffing at the entire discussion, and declaring that the only knowledge worth having was the practical knowledge that enabled a man to succeed in the rough-and-tumble world of politics and commerce, and the crowd, which was composed of citizens and medics and foreigners and slaves, listened to the debate with the rapt attention of men whose eternal fate hung in the balance, and some of them were convinced by the arguments of one school and some by another, and some walked away shaking their heads and muttering that the philosophers were fools who spent their time counting the teeth of horses and measuring the footprints of fleas. But all of them were participating, whether they knew it or not, in the great conversation that was the glory of the Greek mind, the relentless, unceasing inquiry into the nature of reality that had begun on the shores of Ionia, and that would continue through the academies and the lyceums and the libraries and the universities, for as long as human beings continued to ask the great questions and to refuse to be satisfied with the easy answers that the gods and the myths and the traditions had provided. And as the afternoon wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, and the heat of the day began to give way to the cool breezes that blew in from the Saronic Gulf, the city's attention turned once again to the theater. For it was the second day of the city Dionysia, and the crowds were already beginning to file into the great stone theater on the slopes of the Acropolis, a theater that could hold 15,000 spectators, and that was the scene of the most intense artistic competition in the Greek world. A competition in which 3 tragic poets and 5 comic poets would present their works before the assembled citizenry, and would be judged by a panel of citizens chosen by lot. And the winner would receive the laurel crown and the public acclaim that was the highest honor that a poet could achieve, higher even than the wealth and the power that came from political success or military conquest. For the Greeks understood that art was not a luxury or a diversion, but a fundamental aspect of the human experience, a means of exploring the deepest questions of existence, and of creating a shared cultural identity that bound the citizens together in a community of feeling and understanding. And as the spectators took their seats, and the chorus began its opening chant, and the actors in their masks and their elaborate costumes took their places on the wooden stage, the city fell silent in anticipation of the catharsis that was to come, the purging of the emotions through pity and fear that Aristotle would later identify as the essence of the tragic experience, and that the Greeks experienced in the theater as a form of collective therapy, a way of confronting the darkest aspects of the human condition in a safe, controlled environment, and of emerging from the experience cleansed and renewed, and ready to face the challenges of life in the polis. And when the performance was over and the sun had set and the torches had been lit, the spectators made their way back to their homes through the dark, narrow streets, their minds still ringing with the words of the poet and their hearts still heavy with the suffering of the tragic hero. And they discussed the play with their companions and argued about its merits and its flaws and its meaning. And some of them stopped at the wine shops to continue the discussion over a cup of watered wine and a plate of olives. And others went home to their wives and their children and their household altars, carrying with them the memory of the performance and the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than themselves, something that connected them to their ancestors and their descendants, and to the eternal human struggle to make sense of a world that was often cruel and chaotic and indifferent to human suffering. A struggle that the Greeks had elevated to the highest form of art, and that they celebrated year after year in the great festivals of Dionysus that were the crowning glory of the Athenian year.